So, so let's dive in. I know everybody is starting to is continuing to join the webinar. We are recording this session, so fret not. So officially, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Megan Conyers. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Florida Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association, and it is my pleasure to host this webinar for you all today. We have some heavy hitters on the call and are really looking forward to getting the latest and actually tangible and applicable updates for USMCA. I am here to serve as a resource for all of you in the Florida broker and forwarder community, but then also feel free to let us know in the questions box or in the chat whether you have any questions or comments about the points that we're covering today. First, before we dive into the topic, we do have Jeanette Delgado, who's the acting branch chief for broker management from the Office of Trade from CBP. So Janine, I'm sorry, I said Jeanette, it's Janine. And we are going to let you give us some very exciting updates on triennials.
Thank you, Megan. You're not the first to mispronounce my name, so no worries there. I've been called many, many things with my long name. So I just wanted to let everybody know, since we have a captive audience of brokers here today, about the new eCBP portal that CBP has developed for the submission of the triennial report and fee. It is online and it is very self-directed once you get into the portal. It will be open on December 15th. Our CBP website under brokers is updated with that information, including a link to the portal, which will be open again on December 15th. You will have, as a brokerage, you will have the ability to, well, let me back up. In order to access the portal, you need to make sure that you have your license number and your license issue date handy. Those are the two pieces of information that you need to have in order that we ensure you are the, you, the entity, is logging in and completing the form. So make sure you've got those two pieces of information. If you don't, you can certainly email us at brokermanagement at cbp.dhs.gov, or you can email your local port to get that information. It's also in ACE, so if you have an ACE account, you can go in there and verify your information if you're an organization transacting business. You'll be able to upload your employee report into the system. And you'll also be able to complete if you're an individual, you can complete your report and set it to be paid by your brokerage. And then your brokerage can go in and submit a mass payment for you and all the other employees of that brokerage who have identified the brokerage is going to pay. So there's some new flexibility in there. It's much more robust than the pay.gov system that we offered 3 years ago in 2018. We encourage everybody to use it. If you need or want more information about that system, we have user guides, we have frequently asked questions on a link on our webpage is there for that information. It's www.cbp.gov/trade/eCBP. That's the location where there's lots of user guides and frequently asked questions. Also wanted to mention that the advance notice of proposed rulemaking is still out there pending comments. We would love comments from all of you, so please be sure to get those in before the closing of the comment period.
I need that number they just sent you.
Oh, shit, hold on.
The other item that's still out there is Part 111. We are reviewing comments we did receive. We received a lot of comments, and that is in process of review. Also, the last piece of rulemaking is the TIFTIA 116 that is also being reviewed and will be out. Well, will probably be out by the end of the year, but that is also under review right now. If you have questions about anything related to broker management, you can contact us at brokermanagement@cbp.dhs.gov. That is our headquarters location, and we will answer your questions from that inbox. That's all I had.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Janine. And again, guys, I put the URL that she shared, cbp.gov/trade/ECBP in the chat. And if you have any questions related to anything for broker management, feel free to leverage that inbox, brokermanagement@cbp.dhs.gov, or contact your local port. All right, so are we ready to dive into trade agreements?
We are ready to dive in. Megan, why don't I introduce who's going to do the deep dive? Is that good? Does that work? All right. Well, we have two outstanding individuals with us. First, Janine, thank you very much for that update. I don't want to go further without sending appreciation for everything you're doing at Broker Management and for you joining us today. But we have two outstanding individuals who are going to guide us through the USMCA, where we are and where it's going very quickly. First off, I'm pleased to introduce from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Mr. Adam Sulewski. Am I saying it okay? Am I butchering it? Not bad. Adam is the branch chief for U.S. Customs and Border Protection for the USMCA Center. The mission there is to coordinate CBP's comprehensive, consistent, and transparent implementation of the USMCA, which is no small task at all. He began his service with CBP in 2010, has served in several trade-focused roles, including trade agreements and special trade legislation, anti-dumping and countervailing duties, international affairs, congressional affairs, training, and trade stakeholder agreement. He's also a President Management Fellowship alumni and has been recognized with the CBP Commissions Award and the WCO Certificate of Merit. He's an attorney. He has his JD from Suffolk University Law School and is licensed to practice law in New York and Massachusetts. Counselor, your law degree is being put to very good use, I will tell you that. In addition, we're honored to have Mr. Ken Smith Ramos. He is Mexico's former chief negotiator for NAFTA, now the partner at Agon. Agon is a Mexican consulting firm that specializes in competition, regulatory affairs, and international trade. Ken's focus, of course, is to help international clients identify trade investment opportunities because he's negotiated many of the FTAs that Mexico is now a part of, the CPTPP, the Mexico-EU FTA, and of course the NAFTA USMCA. So he brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise regarding country of origin issues, trade barriers, and helping companies expand into key markets. As I mentioned, he served as the chief negotiator for NAFTA, which led to the signing of the USMCA. So he really, through his experience now in the private sector and having spent time in Mexico's Ministry of Economy in the Embassy of Mexico, is a wealth of knowledge and experience that we're so pleased to have today. So I'm going to hand it over to Adam first and then Ken, in light of the fact that we have a lot of information to give. And I think, Adam, as you'll be explaining, we're really entering a critical time period now with the USMCA. I know you'll talk us through the relaxed enforcement period, now looking at more of a normal enforcement period that's starting 1/1/21. So this is around the corner, folks, and very important, I think, for you all as brokers, and if we have importers joining us alike, to really consider what are those changes from NAFTA to USMCA as we get more comfortable with this agreement. What are your responsibilities? Certificates of origin is a bit different from the past, as Adam's going to be explaining, because there's more of a free-form certificate of origin than the rigid one that you used to see from the NAFTA perspective, and really making sure that as customs brokers, you're working with your importers to advise them as to when can they provide a valid claim? What type of information should you be looking for? When is enough, frankly, from the standpoint of compliance? Some changes too as to who could even sign the agreements now that importers can sign them. But again, we've been getting a lot of questions from brokers about that role that they play, the new, not only the new agreement, but some of the changes to the tariff provisions, but also the certificates and how some of the data elements, although they've stayed relatively the same, the process has changed a little bit. So Megan and Adam, is Adam, can we hear Adam okay? Is he okay, or is he muted right now?
I am getting to that. Let me see. All right, Adam, can you hear us?
Can you hear me all right?
Sure can.
Yep, perfect.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Awesome. My computer
All right,
audio shut off for whatever reason, and I was able to get on the
Okay,
phone.
great. Take it away, Adam. It's all yours.
2020, folks, you know. Thank you, everyone. Greetings, everyone. My name is Adam Sulewski. I am a branch chief with the USMCA Center at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Wanted to express the greetings of my director, Queen Fan, who wasn't able to be here today. We're actually quintuple booked right now in terms of everyone in my center covering different meetings. So it's nice to be wanted, but also a very busy time. But I'm very, very pleased to be here today with the Florida broker community. I'm going to be talking a little bit about USMCA. Next slide, please. And I think that this community will be particularly in the know. You guys are very much enmeshed in trade compliance requirements, engagement with CBP. So some of this I won't need to go into great detail, but it's good, a little bit of a refresher. And I'll be giving you, in particular, updates on the current state of things and what to expect in the coming new year. So we'll be looking at the background and overview, resources, touch a little bit on the automotive rules of origin. I realize this isn't a particularly automotive focused group, but it's good to keep tabs on it, and then what to come in the new year. Next slide. So background and overview. So as many of you may know, USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, replaced NAFTA. NAFTA has been done away with. It does not exist anymore as a matter of law. Went into force July 1st of this year. Some of you may be seeing it referred to as CUSMA in the Canadian context, or TMAC in the Mexican context. Those are those titles in those countries, but it is the same trade agreement in all three countries. In large part, USMCA replicated NAFTA's tariff structure and zeroed out tariff policy, but it did address a large amount of updates needed in terms of updates in technology and trade practices that had occurred since the early 90s, and adds new criteria for certain commodities. Again, went into force July 1st of this year. Next slide, please. So we are about 5 months in. Just wanted to highlight that we have had an incredibly active year in the USMCA Center. I'm sure we've engaged with at least some of you. So you can see we've done enormous amounts of training, both internally for our entry specialists and supervised and import specialists, our auditors and field operations personnel, and enormous amount of engagement with the trade. We've had over 60, I think this is number 65 in terms of singular trade briefings with trade associations and industry groups. Quickly to note, the SPI for USMCA is S as in Sam, or S plus for certain agricultural focused commodities where there's a difference in treatment between Canadian or Mexican imports. It's important to note there's only one SPI as opposed to the prior NAFTA where it was MX or CA. We also had engagement a great deal with the Trade Transformation Office for ACE, including 10 war room sessions. That was a marathon late June, early July. There's also a large amount of material, compliance guidance available to the trade. We'll be talking about that in larger detail, but very succinct, implementing instructions, fact sheets, side-by-side comparisons with the former NAFTA and the present USMCA. We've also got supplementary materials, informational videos, an FAQ page, which is constantly being updated, our mailbox. And I and my center have had frequent engagement with the Canadians and Mexicans on coordinated implementation and as we gear for enforcement. And also wanted to highlight our Commercial Operations Advisory Group, the COAC. We have our USMCA Working Group. So take from that there's a great deal of things you should be familiar with. Although USMCA is a significant change for trade policy and trade enforcement, a lot has not changed in terms of all the different ways CBP engages with the trade, collaborates with the trade, and receives your feedback, receives your recommendations. Next slide. Next slide. And resources. To go into it a little bit more in depth for you, we have a centralized location of information on the USMCA, our webpage. Right there, you can see the web address is a bit long. However, if you search USMCA at cbp.gov, this will be the first thing that pops up. All of our resources are consolidated there. We also are able to do informational briefings like I'm doing right now, or if you have a specific group or want to talk about a specific topic, we're eager to engage or get you to the right point of contact within CBP to engage. We've invested a lot of our time in written materials and multimedia materials. And also, although CBP is the main implementer of this agreement, we're not the be-all end-all of all things. There's a lot of other points of contact at Commerce, at USTR, et cetera. And we have a lot of points of contact and other resources also available from external sources at our webpage. Next slide. Some things I wanted to specifically highlight. We do have our public overview of USMCA webinar video. It's getting a little bit old at this point. This was done in late June 2020 before the interim final rule was available. We will be replacing this as soon as all the regulations are done. So stay tuned. That'll be a resource in the coming months. Next slide. Also some foundational documents. I think you all are pretty familiar with these, but it's good to review. The agreement text and the Implementation Act, all publicly facing. We have the uniform regulations, which were mutually agreed upon by the US, Mexico, and Canada. I will say that was done in record time. We had to complete those in less than 3 months between Canada, the final ratifier of the agreement in late March, and the implementation of entry into force on July 1st. And then we have our domestic regs. The interim final rule, as you may know, was published on June 1st of this year, and all of the regulations must be complete per the Implementation Act by July 1st of this year. And then also to note that the general note for USMCA is General Note 11. That's now available. All of these, again, are available via direct link on the USMCA webpage. CBP also published the final USMCA implementation instructions. This is a really important resource for the broker community. It basically is a guide on how to use the USMCA and specific changes between NAFTA and the new USMCA, available on our website. For those in the automotive importing community, there's also specific information from our partners at the U.S. Department of Labor as to the labor value content requirements. And as we get additional final regulations, this document will be updated to reflect that. Next slide. Just also want to emphasize, beyond those foundational documents, we've been doing everything we can to provide clarity as much as we can. So press releases and media engagement. We've also done 6 informational videos on various aspects of the USMCA. Those have also been translated into French and Spanish, available if you want to post them on your own social media or websites. If there's certain stakeholders you want to send to give them kind of like a foundational understanding of this or that aspect of the agreement. Fact sheets, again, on a lot of different aspects of the agreement and the specific changes between NAFTA and the USMCA. A lot has changed, a lot has stayed the same, but a lot has changed as well. And it's particularly tricky because this is the first time we've had a replacement of a trade agreement as opposed to, say, a new trade agreement for a new partner country. So it's important to be thoughtful about the specific changes. And we also, as I said, have our FAQ page, which is constantly being updated. Next slide. Want to emphasize that we have our USMCA webpage, but just also want to reference that there are other resources available to you as well. Specifically, if you want additional assurances that your import process or your specific commodity will receive USMCA special treatment, preferential treatment. We do also have our binding advance rulings. CBP has already begun to issue advance rulings for preferential treatment questions under the USMCA. Just want to note, if you have any binding rulings that confirm NAFTA preferential treatment, make sure you look at it carefully. And is the language within NAFTA you were relying on different or the same between that and USMCA? Because again, there are a lot of similarities, but it is not the same agreement, and NAFTA does not exist as a matter of law anymore. So you might want to even consider seeking an additional one. This is a free service, and we're eager to have you avail yourselves to it. They've already started issuing them, so you should receive it. I believe the deadline is 30 days. You should be getting one within 30 days if you make the application. Also, please do look out for CSMS messages. We've been using that to issue alerts on various aspects of the USMCA and, of course, all other trade enforcement issues within CBP for our trade partners. And then we also use, of course, our Trade Snapshot newsletter for relevant updates for the trade community. And then for those of you who use social media, we've also promoting all of these resources on those social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. And we've also been in close coordination with the CBP Information Center for our call center and the Ask CBP search engine. And if all that I have shared with you haven't answered your questions, we also have our inbox, usmca@cbp.dhs.gov. We're getting a lot of inquiries there, and it's great to be able to answer questions to the trade. We're also getting some questions that stump us, like, we hadn't thought of this or that aspect. So it's been a great resource for us too, to ensure that we are responsive to you folks. So please do make light of that if those previous resources I've described haven't answered your specific inquiry. Thank you. And also just want to emphasize, we have additional government resources we link to on CBP, although they're controlled by other folks. The HTS, of course, our partners at U.S. Trade Representative for larger USMCA policy. There's other aspects of the agreement that CBP is not the lead on, but there is significant change. Digital trade, telecommunications, things like that, that may be relevant to you. There's always, of course, Federal Register notices. Wanted to flag that USTR and Department of Labor have also issued FRNs on specific aspects of the USMCA. And then, as always, if you have questions on how treatment of the USMCA will happen within Mexico or Canada for U.S. exports there, we also wanted to flag our U.S. Department of Commerce International Trade Administration colleagues. Next slide. Now, again, I realize this is not an automotive focus group, so I won't go into great detail, won't read through all of this, but it's good just to note and check. For the automotive rules of origin, one of the largest changes, of course, between NAFTA and the new agreement, including some brand new criteria never before attempted in a trade agreement. These are requiring a large amount of attention, a large number of different officials throughout CBP and the larger U.S. government to ensure we implement it in a way that honors the intent and language of the agreement, but is also workable and functional for our trade partners and clear so that you guys can plan and implement. So specific larger changes include regional value content change. It's being increased and will gradually increase over a period of 3 years. Next slide. I had a question. Are you going to share this presentation? Yeah, I've relayed this to Ms. Conyers, and she can distribute it after the fact. Yeah, this is fine. Distribute. And also, please note that within the regional value content, there's different percentages for different types of parts. So you have core parts, which is increased a certain percentage. Next slide. You have principal parts. And then next slide. And complementary parts. I'll also preface that there is a pending Federal Register notice, which will give greater clarity and detail on how to comply with these rules of origin. Don't want to get ahead of a Federal Register notice. That will be pending in the winter-spring timeframe. So please do watch the Federal Register for that. And as soon as we have greater clarity on when that will be prepared, we'll ensure to alert this organization and other trade associations so that people can anticipate and receive it. Next slide. So we have the increase in regional value content. We also have the brand new criteria of steel and aluminum for both passenger vehicles and trucks, light trucks and heavy trucks. The producer needs to demonstrate that they have procured at least 70% of their steel and their aluminum from North American originating sources. One caveat, the steel or aluminum does not necessarily have to be in the commodity itself, which again, a movement away from an import focus to a corporate and corporate behavior focus. And it has to be certified on an annual basis, as opposed to, say, certifying for each individual import. Next slide. And also a brand new criteria, never before tried, is labor value content. For automotive goods, these are only originating if a certain percentage of the car or light truck, heavy truck by value is sourced from manufacturing facilities that pay $15 an hour. And again, you also have some limitations of no more than 10% on high wage technology and no more than 5% on high wage assembly. This is laid out in much greater detail in the agreement itself. And again, as I said, there'll be additional regulations, but if you work within the automotive community, a lot of attention should be paid to this because there are a lot more requirements and again, novel requirements, never before attempted. Very interesting to see how this will manifest. And we're looking forward to working in partnership with the trade to ensure that it works well. Next slide. Certification requirements. So we've received a lot of questions on certification. How can you be compliant as you seek to receive preferential treatment and comply with verification requests? So just briefly to overview this, unlike in NAFTA, which had a specific required certificate of origin, the USMCA has liberalized its compliance. Have a bit of a reservation.
No. No.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. One moment, folks.
No.
One moment, folks. How's that? How's that?
No, I'm getting an echo.
Yeah, it looks into an echo.
No. No.
Can't hear you.
Okay. So Lenny, is there anything that you want to highlight from what Adam's touched on so far?
I mean, two things really come to mind. One, I think it's very important for everyone to realize that there are a lot of valuable materials available to any importer, any broker that is dealing with USMCA. I think Adam did a good job in highlighting, that some of that information is on the CBP webpage. If you just really search for USMCA CBP, you're going to find not only links to the agreement, but you're also going to find the uniform regulations that in a few minutes, I'd like Ken to talk about how those were developed, because this is very interesting insofar as there was an agreement, there was a uniform set of kind of high level regulations that were established, and then each administration enacted, of course, the USMCA into law. And there's additional regulations that are still being worked on by the three parties for more of those specifics. But one thing that I find, and Adam may go into this in a minute too, is that there's implementing guidelines. And I think—
Can you hear me now, by the way?
Yes, absolutely. So Adam is going to tell you all about the implementing guidelines probably at one point, and what is what does that really provide to you, as well as where he was going now with the certificate of origin checklist. Because I think, Adam, you left off by saying it's a free form as opposed to a specific form. And I think for this community that you're speaking of today, very important for folks to understand the difference of the form that CBP is willing to accept and the time that at which that document must be in the possession of the importer, potentially, if they're to make the claim, because I know there's some differences there. So Adam, I think you're 100%, and I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. Sorry for the audio stuff. It's 2020, folks. It's an interesting year. And notwithstanding, you see how this changed. It's also truly a testament to CBP and to you folks. We have been able to implement this agreement during COVID. I mean, you know, it's truly an amazing accomplishment that there's been so little disruption when you think about it. So I'm really proud of the entire trade enforcement and trade compliance community for all that's been done. But glad to be back with my audio on. If you want to go back real quick. Yeah, so just please note that there is no required certificate of origin. That's a departure from NAFTA. It's been liberalized. There are 9 mandatory data elements along with this certification statement. So you have to certify, make a certification, but there is no required certificate. You have the data elements there, and of course they are in the agreement itself. And please do note the NAFTA certificate of origin, the 434 that's been used for a long while, will not be accepted as a valid USMCA certification of origin. Just note, you can continue to make NAFTA claims on things entered before June 30th. Anything after is subject to the USMCA, and we cannot accept that form. Please note, we do, as was referenced, have an optional USMCA certification of origin template. It's a PDF which actually accommodates numerous different kinds of trade agreements within the US. So there's a drop-down menu for USMCA, Japan, Bahrain, CAFTA, etc. And that is a useful help if you want help gathering these elements and want to provide them in a succinct way, but it is not a required form, and we can receive this information in any way, in any form. Next slide. I think I'm going a little bit long, so close out soon. Automotive certifications, just note that, again, for labor value content and the steel and aluminum, those have to be done on an annual basis. Here are the citations here, and for greater clarity, caveat that of course we will be pending new regs, but the basics are present in the interim final rule that was published this past June 30th. And automotive producers, exporters, and importers are allowed until December 31st of this year to obtain and submit necessary certifications and documentation for claims for the next following year. Next slide. And again, for automotive certifications, just very briefly, do note that for labor value content, we will be sharing parts of the information as it pertains to the wage aspect with our partners at the Department of Labor. And then for steel and aluminum, that stays solely in-house at CBP. There's no reason for us to share that with our labor partners. They're solely focused on the wage aspects. Next slide. And I have a question. This certification of origin applies to all merchandise, or for example, some textiles are not included. You certify your compliance, of course, when you make your claim and you use the SPI S or S+. That is your certification that you comply with all requirements of the agreement. And the certification is when, for example, CBP is performing a verification. You would need to turn that in at that time. But I'll get into that in a moment. Please do note, record keeping requirements under NAFTA remain the same in the sense that you have to maintain all records for a period of 5 years. Some key changes, of course. Record keeping can now be done in any format, including electronic format, providing it is readily available on request. And record keeping requirements apply even if the importing party does not require certification or the requirement is waived. So you still have to maintain them as a part of your practice of reasonable care. For automotive, again, considerations, vehicle producers must keep your records also for a period of 5 years. Next slide. So what to expect next up through this next summer? Summer sounds nice right now. We're having a cold snap in DC. I'm very envious of my Florida colleagues. Overall, you can expect more action from CBP. We're going to continue to do trade outreach events. I'm sitting here in the USMCA Center, sitting here figuratively, of course. I haven't been at the office since March, but we've been incredibly active and we're going to continue to be. The center is going to exist for another 3 years. Some of you may be familiar with the NAFTA centers that we had hosted in the early 90s. It's a similar model. We're working to see this through and ensure we truly get this implemented in a comprehensive way before we eventually retire the center. And then it becomes just another one of the things that CBP does, just as NAFTA had become. Additional materials, as the regs become available, as additional clarifications from other agencies become available, CBP will be there to ensure all of you have sufficient compliance guidance. And I've already referenced the regulations. Those will be pending soon. We are going to be here to continue working closely with all of our government partners and the trade community to ensure comprehensive and smooth implementation of this agreement. Next slide. I got a little bit ahead of myself, I'm sorry. So again, I mentioned the outreach, the education. Next slide. And the regulations, some specific things to reference. Many of you may be familiar that CBP practiced restrained enforcement for the first 6 months of this implementation. So for the first 6 months, we did not pursue a significant number of enforcement actions. So there were not that many verifications. There were not that many enforcement actions. That was something we elected to do because of the newness of the agreement, because of the rapid pace between ratification and then implementation in July. And of course, because of the COVID situation and all the uncertainty to many business processes. We are going to conclude restraint enforcement starting on January 1st, and enforcement will begin again. It will not be something you are unfamiliar with. We'll be implementing a risk-based analysis approach to the USMCA, as we do to all of our trade agreements, all of our special trade programs, indeed all of our trade, looking for shipments that present the greatest risk. So it will not be unfamiliar to you. I also just want to emphasize all of the different trade engagement aspects of CBP, trusted trader with CTPAT, advanced rulings, the COAC with ability to receive feedback from the trade. Everything is still there. The Centers of Excellence and Expertise. Although the USMCA is a major change, all of the different ways that we can engage with the trade are still there. This is not anything that you will be unfamiliar with. Also want to reference the USMCA created trilateral committees on trade enforcement and trade facilitation. So say, for example, is there something that's particularly problematic about the agreement you're experiencing? We would love to know if, for example, that fix might be something that Canada or Mexico can address. Please ensure to brief that up through your trade associations so we can receive it. Can we fix it bilaterally? Is this something that is particularly problematic that we need to elevate trilaterally? You know, it's a new tool for us to use. And I've already referenced the regs, but please do know that additional regulations are pending, including a replacement to 19 CFR 181. There will be a new 182 and specific regs for the automotive goods. I think that wraps it up, but I'll be here through the rest of the presentation and can answer questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
Excellent. Thanks so much. We do have one question that came up from Robert asking whether you think that the unit metal or the steel aluminum content requirement sourcing will spur increased demand on USA's metal recycling industry?
That's a bit of an economic question beyond what CBP is knowledgeable about. I would defer to you to the U.S. Trade Representative and the Department of Commerce. Our parameters are really within the enforcement of the agreement itself, as opposed to the economic consequences of the agreement. That's a little out of my wheelhouse.
Yeah. I mean, Megan, I'll chime in just generally speaking. I think that's a great question by Robert, and I think that's something to consider. I think this could spawn more demand for domestic aluminum and steel as well. But we'll see where it goes as a result of the regulations. Before we go to Ken, another question came up, and I think you'll be able to, we'll call this one a softball, I think, but let's see what you think, Adam. One question came up was a verification that does the certificate of origin requirement apply to all merchandise? Is there ever a time when a certificate of origin for a USMCA claim would not be needed coming from Canada or Mexico?
To my knowledge, no. I mean, to make a claim, if you ever have a verification almost always the import specialist or other CBP official is going to seek all of the necessary data elements in order for us to assess that you qualify for the agreement. And that's the certification collectively.
Right.
It can be received in any form, so you don't have to use the suggested template. That's just an aid to help you gather it in a way that's easy for us to read, et cetera.
Yep.
But the obligation is to demonstrate how you achieved how you got to your determination you qualify. So that's the certification. You're, of course, going to receive a verification request. We don't verify most of the trade agreement claims we receive, but you have to be prepared to answer it as part of your practice of reasonable care, and the record keeping requirement should enable you to be able to turn over those materials and comply with the verification request.
Sure. Okay, great. And kind of, you kind of answered it, but just to, clarify from CBP's perspective, the way they're interpreting and reading the agreement, if an import specialist, let's say, says, hey, can we see your certificate of origin? Can we see the proof that you qualify? Would the interpretation of CBP go as far as to say, show us proof that you actually had that certificate as an importer at the time of entry? Or would you go back and say, you know what, as long as you could show us that there is a certificate that's available, then that would be okay. How strict are you about that? Like the physical location of the certificate at the time of entry?
You need to have the information at the time you make the claim, but you've seen the compliance is liberalized. It can be in any form. So, and also it doesn't have to be a physical paper. It can be an electronic record.
Right.
So you have to show that at the time, that's how you ascertained you qualify, as opposed to, did you find the information after the fact and okay, I actually know that I qualify, as opposed to just making the claim and then figuring it out later. You have to have it contemporaneous with the time of your claim. You don't. Then all you're doing is using the SPI to demonstrate you're certifying you qualify, but you need to have that information contemporaneous to the claim to demonstrate you had that and you knew when you're making the claim that you could back it up.
That's great. I think that's really helpful the way you explained it. And then one final thing, and this is kind of high level too. You mentioned that the domestic regulations, we should be seeing those come out also. So are we really looking at, it's just a high level, what do we expect to be in those domestic regulations? Kind of the same types of concepts we saw. Hey, this is part 181. Here's kind of the USMCA version of it. Will that include the marking issues? Because I know the NAFTA country of origin marking rules, non-preference, are in part 102 of the regs. Do we know if that would be a separate, regulatory piece, or do we expect what we saw in 102, or at least a nod as to how those will apply, as well as the traditional NAFTA regs, all will be part of that, or is that still kind of up for discussion?
There will be a new 19 CFR 182 to replace part 182.
Right.
The contents, we are in active engagement with our Department of Treasury colleagues and OMB. That is still to be determined. I don't want to get ahead of the FRN, but please do look for that. But there are active discussions on the best way and the most clear way to publish all that you just referenced.
Perfect. That's kind of what I thought you'd say. Well, that's great. Good to just check. Good answer, though.
Very much to get that to you as soon as we can, and we're working very hard to ensure that it's clear, legally sound. That'll be coming very soon in the new year.
That's perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, then let's go over to Ken, and let's hear it from the Mexico perspective. And of course, your perspective is a negotiator and somebody who really was on the front line with the 3 countries as this unfolded. So Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lenny. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to be with all of you today to talk about the USMCA, what is contained in it, how is it different from the NAFTA, and especially I want to talk a little bit about where we're going and what we can expect in 2021. So Adam talked quite a bit about the specifics on the technical details on customs administration, the certification, and the procedure. So I won't repeat that, but I'll give you more of a general overview at first of what is included in the USMCA and what were some of the key elements that were added vis-a-vis the NAFTA and where we are going. So if we go to the next slide, please. The title of this event is USMCA versus NAFTA, what's different? And the first thing that was different negotiation was that, as opposed to 25 years ago when the three countries negotiated, and this vision that building a free trade area and opening free trade in all three countries would bring benefits to all three countries. This time around, the Trump administration came in with a position that the NAFTA had hurt the US economy. And even though Canada and Mexico insisted there was no empirical evidence to that effect, that was the opening position of the United States. And that, of course, affected a lot of things that they put on the table. So what we did is we presented to our own Senate what you see on screen here, which is the 4 pillars of what we were pursuing in the negotiation, which is on the one hand, strengthening regional competitiveness. So not backtracking on what we had obtained in terms of liberalization of trade in the NAFTA, that is not going back to manage trade, TRQs, or new technical barriers to trade. The second one was, of course, modernizing the agreement, because we saw it as an agreement that had worked well for 25 years, but it needed an upgrade, and it needed to have disciplines that didn't even exist back when we negotiated NAFTA originally to be included in the agreement, because they are now essential to the global economy, such as digital trade, etc. So a third pillar was making the agreement more inclusive and responsible, which means including a set of measures or disciplines on the social side, which were not so much taken into consideration when trade agreements were negotiated worldwide 30 years ago, but issues of gender equality, helping SMEs take advantage of trade agreements, having anti-corruption commitments, which are very important, especially in our country where we're battling with that domestically, and strengthening labor and environmental provisions. And the fourth pillar here was providing certainty for trade and investment. That is establishing a level playing field, transparent and free competition, and of course, dispute settlement mechanisms that can get us back to free trade quickly whenever there is any violation to the agreement. So we started the negotiation on those terms. You know, it's a negotiation that went on for almost a year and a half. So if we go to the next slide, I'll start just focusing very quickly on what I think are the 3 big blocks, the 3 big elements to emphasize what we achieved in the agreement. And the first big element is, of course, that we were able to modernize the agreement. 12 new chapters are added. Many of those include, like I said, new disciplines that were not in the NAFTA originally, and others are upgrading existing agreements, like the areas in intellectual property, customs procedures, of course, trade facilitation, etc. But this is a sample of some of the key elements that were added in terms of, for example, I mentioned digital trade, and it was essential to have a mechanism within our trade agreement that facilitates digital trade, that establishes clear rules on how digital trade should be conducted, not having tariffs on electronic transactions, not having server localization requirements, which is a big problem in many parts of the world, such as Asia, and pretty much helping small and micro entrepreneurs take advantage of trade agreements. That's also done through the chapter on SMEs, which I mentioned here. You know, how to help small and micro enterprises take advantage of the trade opportunities. In the case of Mexico, we have 12 agreements with 46 countries, and it's essential to get micro and small enterprises involved. And so this is not a comprehensive list, but we were able to advance all of these new chapters in order to modernize the agreement. So in the next one, basically, it's just as important, in my opinion, to look at what was included in the final agreement as to what was discarded. In other words, as part of the negotiation, many positions were taken off the table. And since the US guiding premise was to reduce the trade deficit with Mexico, many of the original proposals that the US put on the table involved having managed trade or restricted access for the key export sectors for Mexico. In the case of Canada, some as well. But we were able to eliminate all of that from the agreement. And the bottom line is that we have free trade across all products traded between Mexico and the US, with the exception of those that are subject to either anti-dumping or countervailing duties or suspension agreements, which are very few, just a couple of them. But we were able to get rid of efforts to establish limitations on agricultural trade, on textiles, on government procurement access. And what you will not find in the agreement is a chapter on trade deficit reduction goals. That is the possibility of imposing trade barriers depending on the status of the trade balance. And so that was a big philosophical discussion before, during, and after the agreement. We were able to get rid of that, and I think it's also helps the international multilateral trading system because there is no justification for using the trade deficit as a unit of measure to establish whether you should have market access or not to a country. So that's very important. So the next one, if we also had agreement on the most controversial or difficult issues. You know, there was a lot of talk about these three elements that you see on the screen, which has to do with a sunset clause, whether the agreement would automatically die after 5 years of being in place, unless the three heads of state agreed to continue it. We substituted that with innovative mechanisms for periodic review of the agreement, of how it's implemented. Every 6 years, there will be a comprehensive review with the possibility of adding topics, renegotiating elements, and really keeping the trade agreement as a live instrument that is subject to input from society, from entrepreneurs, from academia, and always trying to improve it. And we did not have that mechanism in the original NAFTA. We were also able to maintain and enhance, in some instances, the dispute settlement mechanism, which originally the US wanted to do away with, claiming that it was an affront to US sovereignty, but we were able to convince the US, and primarily it was the US private sector, let's recognize that, that was able to show the US government the advantages, of course, of having a transparent and expeditious dispute settlement mechanism. Now, Adam touched a little bit about the rules of origin in the auto sector. I must say that this was perhaps the toughest element of the negotiation, because we knew there would be no deal if we didn't advance in the direction of coming to an agreement with the US and of course with Canada, but mainly with the US on the issue of the automotive sector. So I think the overall result is balanced because we guarantee free trade. There's no managed trade in the auto sector. We have robust rules that can promote further regional integration. So from the point of view of Mexico, having a stricter regional value content can help our auto parts manufacturers participate more in the production of automotive vehicles in North America. And if we go to the next one, very quickly, some of the details. You know, it's very important to see how the negotiation progressed, because sometimes if you just look at the final outcome, it's not clear what went on, you know, during the negotiation. And this was, like I said, a very difficult negotiation where the US came in with a premise, which I can somehow understand, which is, you know, we're the biggest market, but not the investment is going to Mexico, and it's going some of it to Canada, not so much to the US. So how can we force investment to locate in the US? And they looked to use the rules of origin to force that type of investment. And our premise was you cannot force investment unless you're in a Soviet economy. So what you have to do, you have to make sure that you do make the requirements stricter to make sure that the benefits for the auto sector remain in North America, but you can't make the costs too onerous, like you see the original US proposals, so that actually automotive companies disinvest from North America and go to Asia or go to Europe or other places in the world. So if we go to the next one, you can see how, and I won't go into the details because Adam covered some of this, there is a new rather complex mechanism which not only increases regional value content, but includes a lot of disciplines on the baskets of the specific parts, essential, principal, complementary, the rules on labor value content, the rules on steel and aluminum. Also, if we go to the next one, you can see another key element, which is what I was mentioning in terms of the balance of the negotiation. We are introducing more costly elements to the administration of the auto sector trade in North America, but at the same time, we obtain a set of guarantees which ensure that for Mexico and Canada, we would be excluded of any national security measure that the US might impose on the auto sector. They did it, as you know, on steel and aluminum. That issue may or may not go away with a new Democratic administration, but the point is to have in the USMCA measures that exclude us from any Section 232 measures. We also are excluded from any unilateral increases that the US may take on the MFN tariff at the WTO for a specific amount of both vehicles and auto parts. So this is sort of an insurance policy that guarantees, that we will have free trade within North America, regardless of what the U.S. does vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We also introduced the concept of alternative staging regimes, which allows companies to request special exemptions or lower or rather longer phase-in periods for some of these requirements, as long as they present a specific plan as to how they expect to comply. So a company that thinks that they may not immediately be able to comply with the labor value content may request for up to 10% of their production to have that phase-in period extended. So you can get a break on specific elements of the rules of origin requirements, and that gives flexibility. And at the end of the day, the result was positive, because in this balance of the negotiation, we haven't had automotive companies, either OEMs or big auto parts producers, leave the region. So I think that's a good result. So if we go to the next one, a key element, I concentrate on the rules of origin because I think that for purposes of what all of you do and in the Customs Administration, it'll be very interesting to see how the alternative staging regimes enter into effect, the yearly auditing of labor value content of steel and aluminum requirements. That's going to put quite a bit of stress, I think, on CBP, on Mexican customs, and in Canada as well. But there's other disciplines that may have a specific impact on the trade at the border for certain products. And we must look, for example, at something that didn't really exist or wasn't a concern in the NAFTA, which is the new labor provisions, which establish specific commitments to combat all sorts of forced labor, child labor, violence at the workplace, discrimination. It has a new labor annex on specific promotion of union democracy, transparency in collective bargaining negotiations, transparency in the way union leaders are selected. And why is this important for the trade operations? Because you now have a chapter with teeth. It's no longer a side agreement. It's a central part of the USMCA itself. And so what this means is that all of these new provisions and requirements and commitments are subject to dispute settlement. And there's a mechanism specifically regarding the union democracy provisions that calls for rapid response mechanisms, quick panels that can be established and can determine if a particular firm at the plant level is not complying with the labor requirements of the USMCA. There can be a panel decision against that company, and the products being exported from that company, in the case of Mexico, for example, into the US or Canada, can be subject to tariffs or to penalties, and basically can obviously affect what goes on at the border when those products have to cross. So this is something that is new. I think it's a positive development in terms of promoting worker rights further than what we had in the NAFTA, but it's also something that can generate obstacles for trading for companies that are signaled or that are deemed to be not complying. So if we go to the next one, basically, one has to look at the USMCA and the differences that I mentioned in terms of the new chapters, rules of origin provisions. A lot of these elements are obviously very important and overall will promote trade and investment in the region. But we cannot leave aside the fact that the USMCA is coming in at a time where we are having the worst economic crisis in North America in the last 100 years. Obviously, the COVID crisis that disrupted severely, especially in the spring, all of the supply chains in North America and the world, and it is having consequences. And one of those consequences is in that a lot of places, including the US and in the developed world, there's a tendency to look inwards, to try to protect yourself when there's an economic crisis, and there's a tendency for growing protectionism. So here you see some of the statements of the key trade authorities in the US that see COVID as having an impact. On the one hand, Peter Navarro talking about how the US should become self-sufficient in everything it produces and not rely on global supply chains, which is economically impossible. And even Ambassador Lighthizer saying that the era of offshoring of US jobs is over, with this emphasis that the Trump administration had, mistakenly in my opinion, that exporting is good, importing is bad, investing abroad is bad. If investment arrives in the US, it's good. So this zero-sum view of trade is incorrect, but it's what it is in the Trump administration. And a lot of this economic nationalism will continue in the US. So what we should do, I think, in the region, and this is something that we're seeing, as a result of the COVID, a lot of companies are introducing the concept of a pandemic into their equation as to where to locate their factories. And this is leading to a phenomenon of nearshoring, where companies are bringing back the supply chains closer to home. And this can benefit North America, can benefit Canada, Mexico, and the US of bringing these factories back to our region. And Mexico should work with the US in convincing the US that investing in Mexico is not offshoring, it's nearshoring, because we are part of the same perimeter of production, whereby building goods, producing goods together, we increase quality, lower prices, and compete with the rest of the world in a positive fashion. So this is one of the tasks as we go forward, as we enter 2021 and a new administration comes into the US. So if we go to the next one, let me delve a little bit into the crystal ball. And based on the changes that exist in the USMCA, what are the big sectors or the big groups of sectors that will benefit most from it? And I have three circles here. The first one is sort of the big ticket items, that sectors that are already big in terms of trade within North America, that have tons of operations daily at the border. I'm sure many of you work with many of these sectors. These successful sectors, the big manufacturing sectors, will continue to be big, because in addition to the fact that free trade is preserved in North America, the customs procedures, the trade facilitation elements, the reduction of paperwork at the border, many of the things that Adam was mentioning, will help reduce cost of crossing the border, hopefully with a view towards reducing crossing times and, of course, helping sectors that were already big exporters. And with the stricter rules of origin, of course, you can attract more foreign investment into North America, because Chinese companies or Eastern European companies know that they can no longer just export their products and get them into the supply chain of automotive in North America. To be in North America and in the North American auto sector, you have to be in North America physically. You have to invest there. So that's an advantage also for the auto sector. The second big group here is what I call the high-tech sectors, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals. As a result of COVID, primarily, we're seeing a ton of new public investment and private investment going into medical equipment, into pharmaceutical, into R&D on vaccines, not just on COVID, but on many other potential pandemics. And so I think this can benefit North America in terms of receiving investment, because for example, Mexico is very well positioned as a platform to provide medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, etc. And the IPR provisions in the USMCA give us the ability to have more of an attraction for innovation and technology absorption in our region, because we're no longer eliminating tariffs like we did in the original NAFTA. We're having a qualitative push forward on promoting innovation and technology. And the last bubble that you see, the last circle, has to do with traditional sectors such as agriculture and agribusiness, which were proven to be essential, of course, during COVID, and are one of the few sectors that are continuing to grow. And that will be the case in North America. And linked to that, companies that are able to provide logistics and transportation services that incorporate technology, cold chain, the ability to transport not just fresh foods, but also, of course, vaccines, medical, pharmaceutical products, etc., and just-in-time inventory for the advanced manufacturing sector will benefit from this trade facilitation under the USMCA. So if we go to the next one, this is a very quick exercise. I won't go into a lot of detail. I'll leave the presentation, of course, with you. But the fact that there's a trade war going on between the US and China has, on the one hand, made Mexico more attractive for foreign investment, because a lot of the components that are no longer being purchased in the United States from China, other countries in the world have the ability to fill that gap. And the UNCTAD did an analysis where it shows what opportunities arise when just 2% of those Chinese components are no longer able to enter into the US market. And for Mexico, you see in the gray box, the opportunities that arise just from that 2% decline on Chinese inputs going into the US, what opportunities that opens up in each sector. In the automotive sector, over $7 billion worth of new opportunities for Mexican products to go into the US. Telecoms equipment, $5 billion, electrical machinery, almost $5 billion, and you can go through all of the sectors in doing this analysis. So it's interesting. In the long term, a trade war between the US and China does not benefit anybody, because it can actually hurt the economies of both countries, and they're both gigantic economies that fuel growth in the world. So the in the long term, the best scenarios for this trade war to end, but in the short and medium term, it has benefited Mexico in consolidating its position as a #1 trading partner of the United States and attracting more investment. So if we go into the next one, I think all of this is important from the perspective of how all of this nearshoring will take place, not just in Mexico. Here I'm giving some examples of the regions of Mexico where some of the key sectors are seeing growth in terms of attraction of investment, even in a situation of the COVID crisis, and even with the economic crisis that we're having in Mexico. I mean, in the second quarter of this year, our GDP went down almost 19%, which is one of the highest declines worldwide. But we're seeing investment in all of these sectors occurring towards the future. That is, of course, a big question, and I won't go into a lot of detail because it's a subject of, we could have another seminar on this, whether Mexico as a government right now is doing the right things in terms of sending the right signals on Mexico honoring its international commitments, creating an environment conducive to investment, etc. But what we're seeing is investment coming in, especially in the northern states, and that will mean more action at the border in terms of putting more stress on border crossing, and the requirements of customs brokers and working with a lot of these key sectors are likely to increase quite a bit. So if we go to the next one, basically, what we did here at our firm in Agon is put together a USMCA compliance checklist, which essentially tries to summarize some of the key elements that any company or any trade association has to understand in terms of what is needed to really take advantage of the USMCA. I spoke already about the labor chapter, how these are disciplines with teeth, with a rapid response mechanism and the possibility of actual trade barriers being erected if you're not respecting the labor commitments. And this obviously could affect companies' ability to export into the other trading partners of the USMCA region. And so we're working with companies in conducting internal compliance audits, sort of preventive medicine audits, to make sure that they are in a position to comply with the labor requirements, not just internally, but also in their relationship with the unions because of the provisions on union democracy. And then there's the entire component, which is sort of the bread and butter of what you guys do, which is understanding everything having to do with the customs procedures, the changes that were done vis-a-vis the NAFTA, understanding the uniform regulations. As Adam said, there was a titanic task, very difficult to do in terms of 3 months before the agreement came into effect. These uniform regulations were negotiated, agreed upon, and published. And so the private sector is just beginning to understand what these uniform regulations are for the auto sector, for textiles, for trade facilitation and verification of origin, all of those issues. So it's very important to understand these procedures, and of course, the simplification of procedures too for trade facilitation purposes, and understanding in general what the rules of origin are. I think the digital trade space is very important for the reasons I mentioned, because now small and micro entrepreneurs with a laptop, with a server, pretty much from their house, can access millions of consumers in the US, Canada, and Mexico. And this is starting to revolutionize the way we trade in the world and in North America. A lot of the provisions, for example, that were changed in the regarding customs and fiscal issues. For example, on the de minimis at the border, it is increased in the case of Mexico from $50 to $117. That will allow for express shipments that cross the border, and that are usually very beneficial for smaller entrepreneurs that don't have large volumes, that utilize those procedures in order to trade goods that could be below $117 worth, are increasing dramatically. And I think that changing the de minimis requirements, increasing it, not to the $800 that the US has, but the negotiation led to $117 in Mexico, 150 Canadian dollars. And that's also a plus in promoting digital trade and operations across the border. And while this final issue that we have here on screen may not be directly related to the work of customs brokers, there's a lot of discussion in North America regarding how energy is included or not in the USMCA. You may have heard that in Mexico, a lot of the policies that are being promoted go against foreign investment renewable energies, etc. The government claims that they don't have commitments vis-a-vis the USMCA, but in fact they do. And we made sure to ensure that the energy reform in Mexico, which allows foreign investment in the sector, was included in the USMCA, just as it is in the CPTPP and in our new European agreement, European Union agreement. So if we go to the next one, basically, I think that overall, this says next steps for Mexico, but it's essentially for North America, which is the correct implementation of the USMCA. We cannot ignore the fact that there are these tendencies in Mexico to become more nationalistic, and it's important that Mexico, shows the example of being open to complying with all the elements of the agreement, and also as a new administration comes in the U.S., that protectionist tendencies in the U.S. do not win the day. So basically, Mexico, the U.S., and also with Canada have to make sure that we maintain free trade in our region. Right now, what is happening, there's the brand new first trade dispute was announced by USTR with the Canadians on the dairy sector. And this was a very tough sector in the USMCA negotiations. Unfortunately, we're seeing an initial dispute there, and there's the possibility of disputes also in the ag sector between US and Mexico. We know the Biden administration will come in with pursuing a lot of the key elements that Democrats pursue in trade agreements, on enforcement, on labor issues, on environment, which the Trump administration didn't really care much about, but we know that Biden's going to push that actively, and on the issue of renewable energy. So we have to make sure that for 2021, we start with the right foot, with an open trade environment, and we don't get bogged down in trade disputes. And of course, Mexico has this wide network of trade agreements with the rest of the world, where we have to promote our exports, attract investment with the CPTPP, with the European Union, and our partners in Central and South America. So if we go to the next one, I think I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this was a useful overview of USMCA versus the NAFTA, and I'm open to any questions you may have. And of course, you will be given this presentation, once we are done, so that you can look at it again. And any questions you may have, please, I'm here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ken.
Great stuff. Thank you, Ken. Do we have questions? Because if not, I was jotting down some questions in the meantime that, thinking of what our brokers and forwarders might be interested in. So Megan, do I have the floor for some questions, or do you see anything that's come in?
Go ahead, and as soon as any other questions come in, I'll cut you off.
You'll tell us. Okay. Well, Ken, as usual, and Adam, again, great presentation, very thorough, very thought-provoking. A few thoughts. So here at FCBF, obviously, we represent customs brokers and forwarders. So from the forwarder standpoint, a lot of them are probably focused on getting cargo out of the US and into Mexico in certain respects. So I'm wondering, kind of a two-part question. One, what has the compliance posture been in Mexico? Was it as relaxed initially as the US? Do you see it continue to go in that direction, to the point that the authorities in Mexico really aren't asking questions to the importers, or are they sending out inquiries, or do we expect that to ramp up? So that's part one. And then the second part, considering the, review enforcement as it starts ramping up, do you have any insights yet as to the quality of the information and documentation you're seeing, let's say, from the US, or you're seeing from other trading partners? Are the invoices looking sufficient? Is the appropriate information being provided so that a Mexican importer can make a good faith USMCA claim? Is there any kind of, as we say, early returns or early results as to what we're seeing? Are you guys, is the report said, hey, we're happy with how it's progressing? Or Lenny, I got to tell you folks, this is what I would suggest US exporters and their forwarders are looking out for, because this is, as a Mexican, authority, what they think is deficient. So I'll kind of like throw that at you and let you answer it however you want. But I think that type of discussion would be really useful for our forwarders and our exporters.
No, absolutely. I think it's very important what you mentioned. I'll start with the last part of your comment and question, which is whether there's any evidence or early results of the information that's coming in. I think it's a bit early to tell. I'm concerned more with Mexican customs and in general, the Ministry of Economy in some decisions that have been taken recently that have been announced without a lot of advance notice on, for example, compliance with technical regulation, with Mexican norms for products coming in. It used to be the case under the old law that you could actually, obtain in Mexico the certificates that prove that you're complying with Mexican technical regulations, Mexican norms. And now from one day to the next, this about, a month and a half ago, the Mexican government published a rule where all of the incoming products into Mexico have to come already with their justification of how they're complying with specific norms. And in certain sectors, such as electric and electronic products, it's creating quite a bit of problems at the border, because obviously the shipments arrive and they are used to operating in a certain fashion. When it arrives at the border, they do whatever they need to do in terms of the certification of the norms in Mexico, but it's usually a pretty clear channel for crossing the border. Whereas what we have seen with some of these sectors is a piling up of shipments at the border. For example, companies, we work with a company that's involved in electronic surveillance and security systems, cameras and special cards that allow you electronic access. And a lot of these products and servers and computers that are coming in, they stop them at the border and they say, now you need to justify the moment you arrive how you're complying with the norms. So we have been working with some of these companies to make sure that these new requirements do not become actual technical barriers to trade. A lot of these companies, of course, have commitments with their clients in Mexico to deliver goods within a certain period of time. So if stuff starts piling up at the border, it becomes an issue. So I think that's one of the main elements right now. The other elements when it comes to another sector, which is, for example, on food labeling, Mexico just implemented a rather complex system similar to the Chilean system on food labeling, establishing warning signs on excess of sodium, calories, fat, sugars, etc. And this is being enforced haphazardly. In some products coming in are being tagged as being sort of deserving of these labels, where in other countries they are not. So the claim is that it's these labeling requirements are being too strict and are creating costs. And in fact, the US, Canadian, and some European governments have already raised the issue with the Ministry of Trade. So I think there are some issues at the border having to do with technical regulations, with labeling, that are creating additional requirements that were not sort of contemplated in the USMCA rules as such. I would say that in terms of a relaxed compliance, I'm not sure how it compares with the US. Maybe Adam has more information on the US side, how that is being implemented there. But I think it's the type of enforcement is similar to what we had before. The big question is whether these new rules that are being put out are going to actually generate trade barriers.
Great. No, I really appreciate that. That's very helpful insights, especially on some of the labeling issues, because that's critical for us too. Adam, my thought from CBP is, because we're in the relaxed compliance, we're really not necessarily seeing the big issues or problems yet, but am I wrong? Has CBP kind of dug in to an extent, and already are there some, let's call it again, early returns in as to, hey, there's certain types of commodities. I know the auto's a whole, realm amongst itself, but anything that's surprisingly good or bad at this point, or is it just too early to know, Adam, as far as what you could tell us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Restrained enforcement is restrained. So there has not been the normal amount of verifications going out. So it's difficult to say in comparison to NAFTA. We're also in the COVID environment, of course, so it's even hard to compare use of USMCA now versus NAFTA the same time last year, right? But we can say USMCA is being used, just as NAFTA been, it's a significant amount of the trade is utilizing the USMCA, receiving preferential treatment. It's truly going to be in the spring, once we get into verifications, audits, other enforcement actions. We'll have much more information as to what violations, what nature, what commodities, what regions, that we're looking at. We have done some enforcement actions. There's been some aspects of it, like, for example, the Enforce and Protect Act with EPA, very time sensitive deadlines for compliance. And, we've allowed them to move forward with that. But no, by and large, no, I can't say yet, but we will. We're looking very much forward to getting to a normal period of engagement and compliance work with our trade partners.
Sure. Yeah, it's going to be happening. Absolutely. Let me ask you guys, and it could be high level unless you have any anecdotes. How about apparel? That's of interest, I think, to South Florida from the import side, the export side, not only from the standpoint of cotton that, might be coming out from Northern Florida. Or the Southeast, where it is shipped out of Port Miami, Port Everglades, for example, or even Tampa. The feeling is that the rules are pretty similar. TPLs, the tariff for trade preference levels, have been a bit liberalized in certain respects. There are a few, let's call it tripwires, maybe now, looking at the sewing thread that needs to come from the region, which I don't believe was the case in the past, although that was the case under CAFTA. So this trade community is somewhat familiar with it. Are any thoughts on that as to, how that was implemented, what you would advise importers, brokers, or even exporters and forwarders to be aware of in that regard, and how you see that being implemented? I think any just thoughts, as to how it was negotiated or what you're seeing now would be really helpful for this group.
Well, maybe I can tell you a little bit in the negotiation. As you saw in the presentation, I listed textiles as one of those sectors where we avoided what I think would have been a major mistake, which is trying to take the same approach to textiles and apparel as the US was taking on automotive rules of origin, essentially saying everything North American, nothing from anywhere else. And we knew from the productive sectors of all three countries in the textile and apparel sector that this was just simply impossible. Or in some cases, if you had to substitute inputs that usually come from Asia, certain synthetic products, sewing threads and others, it would take quite a bit of time. So I think at the end of the day, we were able, as you say, to obtain a negotiation where the TPLs were not done away with, which was the original position from the United States. So in some areas they are liberalized. So if you go into the details, there's quite a bit of balance and sort of almost product by product negotiation to make sure that we wouldn't leave producers and obviously consumers uncovered in Mexico. The issue of the sewing thread was very important, for example, for the lining of suits. We had endless discussions with the US primarily, some with Canada as well, but primarily with the US on the importance of sort of not seeing the entire forest and not just the tree in front of you, which was, yes, you could try to favor, having more North American content with the sewing thread requirements. But at the end of the day, if you made it less competitive, you would lose out to, Asian suits coming into the region, which is already a big part of the import. So it depends on who you spoke to, whether you talked to the textile guys, to the fiber guys, or of course to the apparel people. The positions are always very divided, as you know, in textile negotiations. I think at the end of the day, it was a positive outcome. I think from what we're seeing in terms of the trade numbers, of course, with the caveat that we are in a COVID year and there was a decline in all sectors, I think that it's not having a negative impact, at least so far, in terms of the changes that were done. Mexico, as you know, you mentioned cotton. Mexico is a large importer of cotton from the United States, from Texas, from other regions, I'm sure from, in terms of Florida as well. So that's something that we maintained. There are some issues in terms of, going to the, in terms of the production of cotton in Mexico. The Mexican authorities have actually shut down the import of GMO cottonseed from the US, which makes no sense because it is allowed under our law, under law of GMOs in Mexico. And this actually, USTR has raised it as a potential first trade dispute between Mexico and the U.S. It's not especially related to apparel in the way that you asked the question, but I think it is relevant because it is part of that value chain that is very important. What is the problem with this measure that Mexico is putting into place? It hurts U.S. GMO cottonseed exporters, but it actually helps cotton producers in the U.S. because Mexico will not have the access to the high quality productivity wise that is brought from the GMO cottonseed, and we are likely to increase imports of U.S. cotton. So I think that's going to happen in 2021 while this trade dispute on the cottonseed is resolved.
Very interesting. Thanks for those insights, Ken. Adam, any thoughts on apparel, TPL? Have you, maybe, just wondering, have you been getting a lot of questions about it, or is it pretty much business as usual, except for some of these tripwires I mentioned?
We received questions, and we're working in close partnership with the textiles branch within CBP Office of Trade and with our apparel and wearing apparel and footwear center in blanking. Not enough coffee today. San Francisco, I believe. Yeah. So,
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So, working in close coordination with them, textiles continues to be a very large object of concern for all the trade policy creators within the U.S. government, and we're working hard to implement the instructions we receive. And there are some fact sheets specific to apparel and the tariff preference levels you mentioned with our website.
Great, appreciate that. So I see that we're really coming now to the end of our session. It's really flown. There's just so much information. What I'd like to do is just really have both of you, Ken and Adam, just take a minute and just what would you leave, for the broker forwarding community in South Florida and importers, exporters, and we have seaport officials on and airport officials today. What would kind of be your closing thoughts as to, hey, be aware of this, or this is what I really want to leave you with to make sure that you are successful, whether it's taken from the import or export side, with regard to the requirements that we're seeing for USMCA, kind of what would be your final words of wisdom, so that you don't have any abrupt changes when it comes to the normal enforcement, as we're saying. And why don't we start with you, Ken, and then we'll go to Adam.
Well, thank you. Well, I think that Adam covered a lot of the key elements on the customs procedures and the certification. Those changes that are taking place in terms of the certification, the way some of the verification will be done, the information, the record keeping that you have to have in place, working with clients and helping them understand those key changes and those key elements are essential. There are, depending on the sector, a lot of questions as to how these rules will be implemented. I think it was useful to spend some time talking about the automotive rules of origin, because it's very complex, and from the point of view of never having introduced these types of concepts in any trade agreement, we're really going to have to learn by doing, right? When it comes to the issue of how labor value content is going to be audited or calculated, or the averaging that you're allowed to do under the uniform regulations, it's really uncharted territory. So really delving into understanding those uniform rules of origin in autos, in textiles and apparel, as we were discussing a little bit, are essential. And overall, in trying to help your customers understand where they stand vis-a-vis the new rules. I think, if you focus on a lot of these sectors, a lot of these elements, we'll be all right. And of course, we'll see where we are in a year when of the first year of entry into the USMCA.
Absolutely. Thank you for those thoughts, Ken. How about you, Adam?
Two thoughts. One, we also receive a lot of questions regarding merchandise processing fees. Some of you may be familiar. If you're filing a 520D claim in a post-summary correction context, claiming preferential treatment, we're not able, under the USMCA or its implementation statute, to refund your MPF. We have alerted our colleagues in the US Congress, and from media reports, I don't have any special access to what's going on the Hill, but that emphasis may be addressed in the coming months. Just please know, if there is a change, we, CBP, will work to ensure maximum clarity for the trade as soon as we receive that clarity. Just please do that. That may be addressed in the coming months, but I emphasize it's in the political realm, not within the trade enforcement realm. And also, beyond USMCA, there are numerous additional instruments that may come into force in the coming years. Trade agreement with the UK, trade agreement with Kenya. GSP, of course, has to be resolved if it will be renewed or not. But please do know, whatever those things happening in the political realm and the economic policy realm, as soon as we receive final instruments or clarity, we will work unceasingly to ensure maximum clarity for our trade partners, to ensure you all know what are the changes, what are new rules, what are new trade instruments you can take advantage of. CBP is here through pandemic, through all the different things as a partner, and we're very eager to continue these important relationships with this trade association, with the individual customs brokers, the entire community.
Well, thank you for that, Adam. We really appreciate you and CBP participating today. We know you're extremely busy, especially at the USMCA Center. Also, really happy that we could share your presentation with our membership, which has some important links and resources so people can stay updated, because that's a big piece of what we do at FCBF, getting the information in real time for real life decisions when it comes to trade on a daily basis. And Ken, always a pleasure to work with you. I'm really thrilled I was able to introduce the FCBF to you. As I started to tell Megan, we're looking forward to a long-standing relationship with you and your group to really be our go-to people in Mexico to really keep us apprised of what's going on. And I know we said in a year, we'll probably have to come back and reconvene and see what's going on, but I have a feeling we may want to share some more information together even before that. So
Absolutely,
again,
I hope so.
Absolutely, we'd love that. So Ken and Adam, thank you so much. And to everyone joining us today on my behalf, really happy we could pull this together for our members, and for those I won't be seeing, happy and healthy holidays to all of you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Megan to close up.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, guys. I don't have anything else to add to the content of the conversation. Simply that you will be receiving this in the next 24 hours. So thank you so much for spending time with us, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.